Hello, everyone. Welcome to this talk arranged by the Friends of Marble Hill. I am John Anderson, the chair of the Friends of Marble Hill. We have the usual housekeeping arrangements for this talk. Your cameras and microphones will be switched off, and we will be recording the event. If you want to ask any questions from our speaker, perhaps you would use the chat function and address them directly to me, and I will try to curate them in some way and put them to our speaker at the end of the talk. The Friends of Marble Hill was formed in October 2020 to help ensure that Marble Hill has a sustainable future by engaging and involving a very wide local community to use the site more sustainably and extensively. Our purpose is to promote the heritage and natural diversity of the site, to raise funds and to encourage the voluntary support that will be needed by English Heritage to run the house and park in due course. We're particularly keen as Friends to increase the relevance of the site to a much younger audience and to build their involvement in its future. We're also very keen to encourage a better understanding of social history in Marble Hill and its immediate surroundings. And in that context, it's my great pleasure to introduce our first ever speaker, Jonathan Crofts. Jonathan had a career in theatre and television, including the BBC, and now all over the world as a consultant in media and broadcasting. But most importantly for us, he has been a local resident in the Cambridge Park area of Twickenham since 1993, which is no doubt what spurred him to write his first book, called Meadows, Munitions and Munitions, Stories and Lives of Cambridge Park. This is a well-researched book and illustrated history of that part of Twickenham, and Jonathan has unearthed an amazing number of photographs, artwork, maps and architects' drawings of the area covering the last few centuries in writing the book. But really importantly, he has identified the characters who lived and shaped the history of Cambridge Park. And his book is as much a tribute to those individuals as it is a reflection of its history, its buildings and its gardens. And so without any further ado, Jonathan, I hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, John, very much indeed. Hopefully you can see my slides now, and welcome everybody. Thanks for that kind introduction. So just to recap what I'm going to cover tonight, the Cambridge House and Park area, I think, has a history just as rich and diverse really as Marble Hill House and Park. So I'll take you through how the original 17th century Twickenham Meadows became Cambridge House and the Cambridge Park estate. I'll cover a little bit of the two families of developers who transformed the area in the 19th and 20th century, and asked the question raised, I think, by Sir Vince Cable when he wrote the foreword to the book, were these dodgy developers really, or my term, local visionaries. I'll also cover a little bit of how the area became a certain Belgium-on-Thames around the First World War, with the Belgian community that grew up here, and how that munitions factory that was at the heart of that community became the world ranking Richmond ice rink, and sadly then met its demise in the late 1980s. For anyone who's not familiar with the area geographically, if we look at John Rock's map from the mid-18th century, here on the right, and you can see the river bending round, curving round on the right-hand side of the map, and top left Richmond Ferry, which became Richmond Bridge later on. Bottom left, we have Marble Hill down here. In the southeast corner of what became the Marble Hill estate were the glass house buildings, and there's a whole separate story around the glass house. And it's also rather curious that at this stage, those were the only buildings that were named on John Rock's map. And then moving to the north a little, we have Twickenham Meadows that became Cambridge House in the 19th century, up by the ferry, and then some of the grounds and gardens that were surrounding it as part of that estate. Ferry Lane, which ran from the ferry, became known as Richmond Road once the bridge was built, and effectively ran from the north of the Cambridge House Park Estate all the way down to Twickenham, running along the north of Marble Hill. An earlier map of the area is the Moses Glover map from 1635 that can be seen at Sign House in Isleworth. This covers really what is largely the estate of the then Earl of Northumberland, later Duke of Northumberland, and the Isleworth Hundred, or the Isleworth Hundred, as it was known at the time. And we can see just here where the black arrow on the left is, that's the site of Twickenham Meadows. And on the right, there's a blow up of that map in a different form. And we can see Twickenham Meadows down here, ascribed at the time to the Countess of Totnes. Richmond is just down here at the bottom of the map, bottom left, just below the river. Richmond Ferry can just be seen worded there. And then further to the north in this map is Ham House, and obviously Twickenham, vulgarly called Twickenham. So that sets some of the context of the geography of the area. So the Twickenham Meadows house, pictured here in 1803 in an engraving by John Landseer. So this was the Jacobean house, first built around 1610, and the gardens that went down to the river, just seen here, the river over here with Richmond Bridge just in the background there, and parts of Richmond in the distance over here. And then another view on the right of Cambridge House as it was known by this stage in 1905, and after it had been transformed by the architect Lewis Williamy under the ownership of Henry Bevan. And Williamy basically added the two bays at the front of the house. This is still the face that faces the river, and added on the conservatory and other buildings to the left of the main building. So that gives some sense of the house as it was before it was finally demolished, sadly, in 1937. So there were 14 owners of Twickenham Meadows, Cambridge House, over its 400 years before it was taken over by the developers. It was first owned and we believe built by Sir Humphrey Lind, beginning of the 17th century. His name continues today in the Lind House care home that is in the Cambridge Park area, not far from where I'm sitting at the moment. So his name has continued. The house passed through the ownership of the Countess of Totnes, as we've heard, Thomas Lawley, and then into the Ashe family for the next 4 periods of ownership. I won't cover the Ashe family tonight. There are lots of stories around them, both positive and more negative. They had a close connection with the Wyndham family, who owned their family estates in Felbrigg in Norfolk. Felbrigg, which some of you may know, is National Trust property today. And the names, so the names Ashe became intertwined with Wyndham, and then later Wyndham Bowyer. One of the more intriguing characters amongst the owners of Cambridge House, Twickenham Meadows, was Valence Comyn in the middle of the 18th century. I think he basically took over ownership to help the Wyndham Bowyers out of their financial straits. But he was a curious character. He backed privateer raids, pirate raids in the Caribbean, and made quite a lot of money out of that. He also was something of an accountant and drew up life assurance tables based on life expectancy as part of his work, and was an early exponent of the whole process around that. And while he owned the estate, he also sold land to George Pitt of Orleans House, which is to the west of Marble Hill, and also to Henrietta Howard, mistress of George II, who was the owner of Marble Hill at the time. The Cambridge family ownership was for approximately the next 80 to 90 years. Richard Owen Cambridge, perhaps the most well-known owner, and then passed on to his son on his death, George Owen Cambridge, who became Archdeacon Cambridge, and is known in the Twickenham area for the Archdeacon Cambridge schools, which still exist today. And it was George Owen Cambridge who renamed the house the Cambridge House in memory of his father. Henry Bevan, I mentioned earlier, he was a member of the Barclays family, so the family that was behind Barclays Bank. He was exceedingly rich, and that's partly how he was able to commission Lewis for the army to make the changes to the house, and also spent money transforming the gardens and built some of the kitchen gardens to the west of Cambridge House. For various family reasons, the house passed into the ownership of Lady Chichester, Lady Caroline Chichester. Vince Cable described her as having a little bit of aristocratic NIMBYism. She was the owner who opposed the early proposals to establish tramways in East Twickenham. In fact, when that bill came before the Commons, her solicitor stated that it would be intolerable to have the ragtag and bobtail disgorged before her ladyship's lodge. It was in fact another 25 years or so before the tramway system finally came to East Twickenham in 1903. So if we take a bit more of a look at the Cambridge family and the coterie around Richard Owen Cambridge. Cambridge himself, Richard Cambridge, his father died when he was 9. He was partly brought up by his mother's brother, Thomas Owen, who was a wealthy retired lawyer. Richard Cambridge inherited a vast amount of money. He went to Eton, then on to Oxford, where he was a fairly undistinguished scholar. And he was unsuccessful in law when he went on to Lincoln's Inn. But with his wealth, he really didn't have to work much for the rest of his life. He married, bottom right here, Catherine Mary Cambridge, who was the daughter of George Trenchard, who was the MP for Poole in Dorset, and also granddaughter of Sir John Trenchard, who was Secretary of State to William III. And their relationship and marriage lasted really as an affectionate attachment, as it was described, for the next 60 years or so. And it was an older gentleman that Richard Cambridge rather touchingly remarked that there is no sight so pleasing to me as seeing Mrs. Cambridge enter a room, and that after having been married to her for 40 years. In 1751, he bought Twickenham Meadows, as it was then known, and Horace Walpole, up here on the right, top right, who of course was resident at Strawberry Hill in this period. He was a frequent visitor and sometimes his welcome. He also wasn't terribly keen on Mary Cambridge, and for some reason described her as old cherry tree. But he did say on the occasion that he overstayed his welcome, and his stay spilled into prayers, family prayers in the house that evening, that he said, "Old cherry tree was very good humoured and gracious." However, it was a little bit later that he remarked about her, "A Yorkshire Sunday is as prudish as Mrs. Cambridge." Richard Cambridge himself established himself really as a leading member of Twickenham society. He appeared to know everybody. He knew James Boswell, the biographer, Samuel Johnson, the writer, Joshua Reynolds, a famous painter, who also lived up on Richmond Hill for a period. And he seemed to know most politicians and aristocrats of the time, including Lord North, who was Prime Minister to George III. Walpole remained a great friend and was very proud of all the relationships that the two of them had. He once wrote, "We shall be as celebrated as Bay or Tivoli, and if we have not such sonorous names as they boast, we have very famous people. Clive and Pritchard, the actresses, Scott and Hudson, the painters, my Lady Suffolk, famous in her time as Mrs. Howard of Pope and Gay, Mr. Hickey, the impudent lawyer, Whitehead, the poet, and Cambridge, the everything." And his term, Cambridge, the everything, really was a tribute to Richard Owen Cambridge, whose interests and accomplishments, I suppose, because he had so much time on his hands, but he clearly was a very gifted man. His accomplishments were many and varied, including a flair for landscape gardening. And in line with 18th century gardening trends at the time, he transformed the formal gardens fronting the house so that they became much more open and a little bit more of a pastoral idyll. Cambridge, Walpole and Soame Jenyns, the contemporary writer and MP, were known collectively as the Old Wits, and they used to attend gatherings where George, who later became Archdeacon Cambridge, where he, as a young curate of 27, first met Frances Fanny Burney, who was the successful author of Evelina and Cecilia at the time. That appears to have been a mutual attraction to begin with, and Miss Burney was remarked as having an admirer in George Owen Cambridge. It also transpired that she had something of an admirer in George's father, Richard, who spent a certain amount of his time with Frances Burney, causing a certain amount of consternation amongst the ladies of their company. Frances also developed something of a relationship with George's sister, who was called Charlotte, and their relationship was lasting, went on for many years. But sadly, in the end, George never completely reciprocated the arrangements, the affection that Frances had for him, and maybe a little bit overshadowed by his father, never actually declared his love for her. And she went off and married Alexandre d'Arblay, who was a French emigre who'd come over to England after the revolution in France. George Owen Cambridge went off and married the young and beautiful Cornelia van Meerop. So Richard's time with the estate came to an end. George took over, spent a number of years there with his wife, and sadly, as he was approaching 80, it was clear that they had financial challenges. They eventually sold off part of the estate because they couldn't afford the repairs to Cambridge House. And in this map, Warren's map of 1846, section A was drawn around here. That was sold off to Henry Bevan, who made all the changes to Cambridge House. And George Cambridge and his wife held on to part B here, just to the south and west. And they built Meadowbank, the original house at Meadowbank, just down here as their residence at the time, and in fact also built Meadowside Cottage, which was the precursor to the Meadowside Art Deco flats, which are there today. One of their other buildings was the Ely Lodge, which was built as an entrance to their grounds, and that was sited just here on the map, where Alexandra Road is today. In fact, the more modern block of flats that sits there today is still known as Ely Lodge. But the original building that was quite rustic in style for the time persisted into the 20th century, and was photographed here in 1910, and still there at that time. So we move on into the period of development, and the first family, the Little family, appeared mid 19th century. Jeremiah, the father, was a respected builder from Kensington, and he had three sons, Henry, Alfred, and William. Henry perhaps became the better known and one might say more successful of them. He's pictured here in 1899 with the flowing beard. He became chairman of Twickenham Urban District Council, and was also a Middlesex County Councillor and churchwarden of St Stephen's Church, which he helped found. And if we look at the Ordnance Survey Map of 1894, which was around the time that their developments were complete, Jeremiah and Henry had initially bought the 10-acre field just here, just northeast of Marble Hill. That was dissected by the ancient right-of-way just here, which is today known as St Stephen's Passage. And they built houses on the west side, northwest side, known as Beaufort Villas, and on the east side, a series of semi-detached houses, now Cambridge Park Gardens. They also built 6 more detached villas, Victorian villas, down here along the carriageway that runs from the inn that you can see on the map here, which is still the Rising Sun today. And they built a coach house for Alfred, just here, just north of Marble Hill. And that development really completed the triangle of land in the middle here, which has since become Cambridge Park Bowls Club. The coach house can still be seen today, although it's somewhat hidden behind a 1930s house that was built in front of it. In 1968, they built 37 houses on the Cambridge Park estate and another 5 in Richmond Road. They demolished the old lodge by the rising sun and built an entrance to coach houses and stabling that became Beaufort Mews down here, which is just north of the car park for Marble Hill today. They also built Cambridge Park Mews behind what is now Alexandra Road, with more stabling and living accommodation. And St Stephen's Church, part founded by Henry and Alfred Little in 1875. The church started building, but wasn't in fact complete until early in the 20th century. And they were still owning 20 houses or so and 16 stables at that time. Jeremiah Little never saw the beginnings of St Stephen's Church. He died in 1873. Henry lived on at Cambridge Park House, and Alfred lived on in Cambridge Park as well. And Henry, again, as a more extensive developer, went on to develop the Barons closer to St Margaret Station today, and went to live at Barons Holt, which is number 14 there. In terms of their legacy, it persisted for a century or more. They left some very fine Victorian architecture. Quite close to where I live is Hatfield House, which was a prep school in the 1930s. Burley House is not too far away, was a nursing home for part of its history as well. And in fact, Virginia Woolf spent time as a mental health patient there 2 or 3 times during her life. The coach house still persists and has become a family home, photographed here in 2006. And one of my favourite properties, Beaconsfield, photographed last year, sits back from Cambridge Park now. There are also other buildings, not all of which survived. Glenshee was removed for some of the later post-war developments, seen here in the sale notice from around about 1907. Again, was quite an impressive property. So the next family of developers, the Foulkes, appeared end of the 19th century. Henry bought Cambridge House, seen here in 1900, 3 years earlier than that, and also bought 30 acres of land. He worked with family member Morley Punch and Foulkes. Their names are highlighted because those names have persisted in the names of some of our local roads. I'm sitting today in Morley Road, in one of those houses. They also built a series of mansion flat blocks, of which Richmond Mansions is one, photographed last year. They all had similar designs, similar decoration around their fairly grand entrances. And the Foulkes developed another 4 residential roads, Alexandra, Cambridge, Clevedon and Denton, and also the shops on Cambridge Parade, which were later renamed and renumbered as Richmond Road. And I suspect most people who live locally will know the Charles Harry Pharmacy, which is still there today with very much the same facade as it's always had since it was first opened over 100 years ago. So if we look on the right here at the Ordnance Survey Map from just after this period, this was reviewed and revised in 1910, 1911. We can see Cambridge House up here, just by the river, curving round as on the other maps. The bus garage that was built and also became a tram garage just prior to 1920. And the beginnings of some of the commercial buildings that I'll come on to just to the south of Cambridge House. The road that the Foulkes built, named Cambridge Road, and there's Cresswell Road, Morley Road, Alexandra Road running along here, and Denton Road running at the bottom down to the pathway that belongs to that leads to the river now, and also Clevedon Road that was begun at this time, that runs down here next to what is now. Interesting on this map that even at this time there was still a sheepfold on Marble Hill, still quite rural, even in 1910, 1920. And we can see the Meadowbank House and Meadowside Cottage and the observatory that was there until later in the 20th century, that was built by George Bishop. And on this view on the left, an aerial view, and again a similar view up to the north here. We can see the commercial buildings and what eventually became the ice rink, the bus garage here, and Cambridge House here, and then the residential streets off to the left, to the west, and then some of Richmond Road running along here. Just to the north of Richmond Road, you can see the old Gaiety Cinema building that later became the Temperance Billiard Hall. So the transformation of Richmond Road at the time is 4 lovely postcards from early in the 20th century with the tramway that started in 1903. In the background here, top left, we can see Richmond Bridge in the background, and then these fine Victorian and Edwardian facades to the shops that ran along the south side of Richmond Road, and very much a posed photograph of the tram here that ran from the bus garage down towards Twickenham. The trams lasted till about 1924. There was a debate to turn them into trolley buses, but they would have needed a turning circle, which would actually have gone around the top of Morley Road and Alexander Road, and was resisted by the residents of the day. On the right here, view in the opposite direction, looking away from Richmond Bridge. Again, on the north side of Richmond Road here on the right, fairly undeveloped at this stage. That development came later, and of course has just been transformed with the building of the new Little supermarket. Below that, a view stepping slightly further back from the earlier views, looking towards the bridge again. We can see the corner of Morley Road and the dairy, the Clark's Dairy. The Clarks owned Home Farm just to the north of Richmond Road and ran that as their dairy farm for many decades, and owned the dairy building here that became part of Express Dairies in the 1970s. And bottom left, another view slightly further along, further up towards Twickenham of Richmond Road, and a little bit later, showing some of the buildings that became garages, was starting to support the motor vehicles, the motorised buses and cars that were emerging in the early 20th century. And in fact, one of those buildings is still the Quick Fit garage today. So the next really significant stage was the emergence of the Belgian community and the munitions works around the First World War. A Franco-Belgian engineer called Charles Pellavant arrived in the area and initially set up a munitions works in Teddington, and then was somewhat reluctantly by the council given permission to set up a munitions works just by the river, just south of Cambridge House. This area has since been renamed Belgium-on-Thames by a local historian called Helen Baker, who became something of a specialist in the Belgian community. And there were, in the wider community in this part of London, there were probably something around 6,000 Belgians, with 2,000 or so working in the munitions works that Pellavant built. Both men and women engaged in the munitions works. Some of the women pictured down here at the bottom on this old postcard photograph as well. Some of the women became locally known as Canary Girls because some of their clothing was coloured yellow by the explosives that they were using in the works. And one of my favourite photographs that I compiled for the book is this photograph of a Belgian acrobat just by the works, performing acrobatics, balancing on what I assume are old shell cases, which let's hope were empty at the time. There was a huge number of social and sports clubs and organisations that were set up in the Belgian community. There was also the Pellavant Philanthropic Society, even a contingent of Belgian Boy Scouts. And the Belgians spread not just in East Twickenham, although to some extent centred here because of the munitions works, but they also spread into Richmond and other outlying areas. There was a Belgian cafe just up Hill Rise, just over Richmond Bridge, which seemed to be enormously popular, and I think perhaps became rather popular because actually there was a brothel at this time, which I think was kept relatively quiet at the time. It was interesting that the Belgian and the English communities didn't mix enormously, quite separate to some extent. Education was separate. There was a special department within Orleans School, and entirely Belgian-run schools in Richmond. Nevertheless, there were some relationships between the English and the Belgians, and a lot of local people will know the Hamerton Waterman's family. Alice Hamerton, at the time, her daughter Nellie began working at the Munitions works and met Teddy Lebay, a Belgian, whom she later married. That was one of the more successful relationships. At the end of the war, they migrated back to Brussels and had a son in 1924, also called Teddy, who has lived on and may still be living, in fact, in Brussels into his 90s. So the Belgian influence spread to Richmond Road, taking over many of the shops. Here, on the right here, the building that's still there today, quite close to the bridge. So if you're approaching the bridge from Twickenham, on the left, and there's a grocer's there, watchmakers, jewelers, clockmakers, and a little bit further down here on the left, a little bit further down Richmond Road, a baker's, a cafe, and a number of other Belgian businesses. So the influence really was quite widespread. And in terms of the works themselves, a couple of images here of the buildings and the facades that persisted right into the 20th century. On the right here is the frontage that faced the river and a sentry guarding it in front. And on the left, a number of the workers and some girls, I think, or women, in front of the building. If we keep the architecture in mind, what happened in the late 20s and early 30s is those buildings were transformed into Richmond ice rink, seen here top right in the 1950s with the tea gardens that had steps going down to the river just here, and that frontage that persisted all the way until the building came down in the 1990s. And a couple of images here on the left in the 1970s, top left, the view from the Richmond side of the river, just showing the scale of the ice rink and also the name Sportsdrome that it was known as for a period as well. And then bottom left here, the inside of the ice rink, the domed roof, the domed roof that went over the main ice rink, which again just shows the scale of it. And there was also a secondary rink, which was called the Erosa rink, that was actually built over what was originally a swimming pool. And what happened? The ice rink met its demise in the late 80s. The London and Edinburgh Trust had bought the site and were given permission to develop it. 89, the borough apparently removed their stipulation to plan for a new rink. 1990, local feeling was so strong that there was a petition to prevent its closure. There was a march to 10 Downing Street. And in fact, the 1990s were plagued really by allegations of mismanagement and corruption, and there were ombudsmen and local audits and inquiries and a certain amount of investigative journalism to what had happened and whether there actually had been corruption or not. Even as late as 1995, images here on the right, there was an early day motion in Parliament signed by a number of MPs about the closure and what had happened to it. But sadly, the building came down, and it was very striking during the research for the book how much passion there was for the ice rink and how that persists today. And in the early stages of the pandemic last year, I came across one plea on social media that I'll just read. We were promised a new ice rink. Time has come for it to happen. We as a country need projects like this to restart our country. It's a good time for renewing our thoughts. Maybe we can build kindness, togetherness, and teamwork. I would have given up on life if I hadn't had the family vibes from Richmond Ice Rink. I've been to many rinks and none have made me feel so safe, so at home. So that strength of feeling has persisted. The site became these luxury apartments that can be enjoyed today. The public Cambridge Gardens, seen here in the image, just bottom right, which are there for everyone's enjoyment, and the tennis courts, which are still there. In 2017, Helen Baker, the historian, and others led a campaign to erect a memorial to the Belgians, which went up and was opened in the presence of the Belgian ambassador. One of our local residents, Sue Bonfanti, designed the monument that was carved by a Belgian mason, and in fact has an inscription on it written by a 9-year-old girl from one of our local schools. So that was the successor, and if you like, what that site became. Again, that passion and that affection for the area came across very strongly during my research for the book. I've taken you tonight on a little bit of a whistle-stop tour of the history of the area, for which people have so much affection. We've gone from the Twickenham Meadows in the 17th century through to Cambridge House, and via the developer families, through the Belgian Community up to the ice rink and its demise. There's lots more in the history to talk about, and sadly not enough time tonight. But just as people used to visit, as we can see in this postcard image here, the area back in Edwardian times for enjoyment, and people enjoyed the river and the walks along the river and the walks down to Marble Hill. People are still doing that today. Just like to say a few words of thanks to people who contributed to the book. A few names up there on the screen. I'd also like to thank Friends of Marble Hill for inviting me to this first series of talks, and to all of you for joining today. My unashamed plug for the book, if I may. It's available now. It can be bought online. It's also available at the Open Book Bookshop in Richmond, which is partially open under lockdown. The Charles Harry Pharmacy, which I showed you earlier, and Turner's House, it will be on sale there when that reopens. A couple of plugs as well for talks in the future. My next talk will be to the Turner's House Members Circle, and Minna Anderson, our entertaining Minna Anderson, will be doing a talk on Georgian dinners on the 25th of March as the next in this series of Marble Hill talks. So at that point, I'll pass back to John, who I think is going to moderate some of the questions for us.
Yes, thank you, Jonathan. Thank you very much. Yes, we have had a few questions, Jonathan. They're actually, probably because of your talk, they appear in more or less historical order. So perhaps I can take the liberty of starting with one of my own. On the 1846 map, the Warren map, and then again in the OS map in 1894, there's a very obvious diagonal line from what's now the Rising Sun, appearing onto what's now Richmond Road, which I assume is St. Stephen's Passageway. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yes, that has a curious history in a way. I mentioned that it went across the 10-acre field and had to be preserved by the Littles when they developed that area. It actually went as far as Richmond Road itself, and curiously now has been closed off at the Richmond Road end. If it were still there, it would appear by what is the Toothberry Dentist on Richmond Road. And effectively, physically, it's still there because it runs behind the shops there. But actually, the access is denied. Quite what the legal status of it is now, I'm not entirely sure. And somebody did say to me last year, maybe we should campaign for it to be reopened, but I think that might cause a few issues for the shops and businesses that are there. But it absolutely drove the design of the Little's redevelopment of Cambridge Park, and it's visible today, and much used as St. Stephen's Passage.
And presumably, it's a very ancient right of way, as it were.
It goes back to the successes of what was known as Twickenham East Field, and my guess is that the the term East Twickenham came from that use of the term Twickenham East Field all those centuries ago. That was the wider field of the area that part of which became Twickenham Meadows, and as a lot of people will know, again along the river on both sides, where we are now, was fundamentally just meadows and water meadows, and is still a habitat for bats and other wildlife today, and to some extent protected.
Yes, okay, good. So on a slightly different tack, a question from the audience about Henrietta Howard and whether she moved in the same social circles as the Cambridges. And you said that he was Cambridge everything. I think you referred to him as knew everyone. I assume that she was.
Yes, they certainly knew each other. My sense is they weren't close friends. It's interesting because, of course, Horace Walpole had a lot to do with Henrietta Howard while she was and after she was mistress to George II. But Cambridge certainly visited Marble Hill at the time and knew Countess of Suffolk, Mrs. Howard, whatever you want to call her. So they would have moved in the same circles, and I think inevitably, because their estates bordered each other, they must have known each other.
Yes, perhaps it was a strained relationship when Walpole wasn't so very kind to Mary Cambridge.
Yes, I haven't come to the bottom of it. If anybody knows where this term "old cherry tree" comes from, I'd love to know, because I don't know quite how he came up with that. He of course had lots of names for people. He once called or wrote about Richard Cambridge as Mr. Foot of the Bridge, because his seat, his property, was just by Richmond Bridge itself.
That's absolutely fascinating. What I'm just going to throw in an additional question there about what's it like to uncover these what you might call more social exchanges between quite well-off people who would have otherwise lived some quite separate lives. We think of Henrietta Howard in our castle there, as it were, at Marble Hill, and all these other people building grand houses around her. What's it like to pick up these nuances of the relationships between these individuals?
It's a challenge in lots of ways, because you're going back to writings and documents. I will give credit to somebody who is no longer with us at this stage, because a lot of the early research that I've used in the book actually was done by an amazing lady called Maureen Bunch, who wrote 2 booklets on the East Twickenham area. She subsequently died, but the Twickenham Local History Society very kindly gave me permission to use and adapt her research, and she must have been an amazing lady pouring through so many original documents, and I've added to and enhanced her research. Clearly there's been a lot of research and a lot of interest in Henrietta Howard, and she had quite a coterie as well, quite a circle of friends. Didn't mention Jonathan Swift earlier, although that was a bit of a mixed relationship. But socially they would have known of each other.
Yes.
And a lot of that was associated, of course, with the proximity of the courts. So, the royal family up in London, but Hampton Court not being far away, Richmond Palace for a period as well, and this part of the river really between central London and Hampton Court, much used and much developed for grand houses all the way along it, and a certain amount of toing and froing across the river as well between people. So it was all part of court circles and fundamentally very wealthy and privileged people at the time.
Okay. There's a question about Ryde House, Jonathan. Do you know when Ryde House was built? Because that side of Richmond Road, as you showed it from your photographs, was actually really underdeveloped well into the 20th century, wasn't it?
Yes, it was, and I forget the exact date. There's some evidence that it was built by somebody who set up the coach service between the local area and Hyde Park Corner. Just from memory, I forget the date. Just see if I've got a note here. Here we go. Built around 1832. that again has had a mixed history, and in the 20th century, apparently even the Prince of Wales Duchy originals were used it as offices for a while. But it's one of the houses on the north side of Richmond Road, because so much of that has been redeveloped either by shops in Victorian and early Edwardian times. But Willoughby House and Ride House are the two remaining villas that are still there.
Okay. There's a couple of questions about the Belgians in East Twickenham, which I'll try and take together. There was obviously quite a number of Belgian people moved to this area. Maybe you know something about the numbers of them. There's a question about whether they were welcomed by local residents, or was there any hostility towards them. And sort of related to that, there's a question asking, did Philibon specifically recruit Belgians to work in the munitions works?
His recruitment was certainly focused on the Belgians, and the majority of workers were Belgian. I mentioned Alice Hamilton's daughter, who married a Belgian. It's interesting, actually. The two communities didn't mix an enormous amount, and there were some relationships which ended in divorce. The Hamilton relationship I mentioned was one of the more successful ones. There didn't seem to be an enormous amount of resentment about Belgians coming and being seen as taking housing and taking over the shops. I guess this is wartime we're thinking about, and the Belgians and the English and the British were effectively on the same side and seen as being on the same side. But I wouldn't say that relationships were perfect either.
Yes, I can imagine that. So why did the original St. Stephen's Mission Hall and the school get built adjacent to the Turk's Head in Winchester Road, St. Margaret's, rather than near St. Stephen's Church?
Yes, that's a good question. The history of St. Stephen's started with more in Orleans Road, Montpellier Road area, and partly with all the new developments, the community was so large that a new church had to be built, which is why St. Stephen's was commissioned. From memory, I would need to check this, but from memory there was something of an offshoot, I think around Winchester Road, again just to provide kind of scale for the Christian community, which of course was most people at the time. So there were a number of buildings connected with St. Stephen's. I can't, off the top of my head, answer any more of that, I don't think.
Okay.
Very possible. One of our listeners, one of our viewers may know more of an answer than I do.
Well, actually, thank you for that. That just allows me to point out there's a couple of people in the audience who are living in the area who've benefited in different ways from some of the things you've talked about. There's a lady here who was privileged to train as an ice skater and then laterally coached at Richmond Ice Rink until it was closed, who lives in the local area. And then another who says that the jewellers at the foot of Richmond Road was owned by her uncles, and that the shop opposite the garage in Richmond Road was owned by her late grandfather and then her father. So these connections keep going on, don't they?
Yeah, I came just very quickly. I came across a story actually, a gentleman called David King who contributed to the book. He told me that Henry Foulkes' granddaughter had served in the bar at the Mary Wallace Theatre in the, I forget, 1970s, 80s, 90s, that sort of period. So Henry Foulkes' legacy was quite diverse as well. But it's amazing how many stories just keep emerging. And as one of my neighbours said to me a few months ago, you never really stop with research like this because you continually learn more and more, and sometimes have to correct your research. I mean, hopefully not in terms of what's in the book, but you certainly enhance the research you do over time.
Well, actually, I think that's, I hope that that's eventually something that the Friends of Marble Hill can move into. As I said at the beginning, we're interested in building up a broader knowledge of the social history of the area. And so those sorts of connections and that kind of knowledge could be really interesting and useful to inform things that people say about this area in the future. Jonathan, do you know who built Richmond Bridge Mansions?
So though Richmond Bridge Mansions were built by the Foulkes family, to my knowledge, that they built the majority, if not all, of those mansion blocks. So there are some just by the bridge, which are very prominent on both sides, and then the ones on the south side spread down to where Cambridge House was, and then Richmond Mansions, which was the photograph I showed you, is in fact on Denton Road. So to my knowledge, they were all from the Foulkes family.
Okay. Is a quick question, is Duck's Walk in the scope of your new book, Jonathan?
No, Meadows, when I started, I was just deciding on the geographic scope of the area and decided not to spread north of Richmond Road for a number of reasons. Partly there is so much history up there. That was all part of the original Twickenham Park estate. If anybody's interested, the Twickenham Park Residents Association have put a lot of information online. If you go to the TPRA website, one of their members has documented a lot of material about that part of the area. It's really the north side of East Twickenham. Duck's Walk again has its own history, and there's a fascinating tale of Charles Lightoller, who was an officer on the Titanic, and I think the only officer who survived when the Titanic went down. And then he set up a boatyard along Duck's Walk, and in fact took one of the boats off to Dunkirk with the local Sea Scouts, and brought soldiers back from Dunkirk. But there's so much history up there. It is another book in itself. A certain amount was written by a gentleman called Alan Irwin some 20-30 years ago, and he sadly too is no longer with us. But there are some. If anybody's interested, there are books you can buy on sites like AbeBooks, maybe on eBay, on that area.
I've got quite a few questions now coming in, Jonathan. Has your research extended to the interwar and post-Second World War years? And does it include the industry and factories such as Beaufort Works?
Yes, indeed. Sadly, I mean, 20 to 30 minutes isn't enough to cover the complete history, nor indeed what's in the book. But yes, I looked into the Richmond Bridge Works, which continued until the ice rink site was redeveloped, and the Beaufort Works, which were on the Beaufort Mews site, just north of the Marble Hill car park nowadays. Beaufort Works were munitions of a different sort around the time of the First World War, and in fact after the First World War, but they also produced what were known as invalid cars, so small cars for disabled ex-servicemen in the 20s and 30s. And that site was used right up until the 1980s. And I was lucky enough to have some contact with a gentleman who was managing director of the last business on that site before it was redeveloped into flats in the 80s and 90s.
Okay, and I'll just ask you one very last question, then I'll draw it to a close because we're just past time now. Jonathan, when were the shops built in Richmond Road with the flats above, near Richmond Bridge?
So again, the majority of them are done by the Foulkes family, and certainly the ones on the south side were all part of that Foulkes development. The site to the north was redeveloped later in the 70s and 80s, and it was that 80s building that came down as being replaced by the new Deer Park School and the new Little supermarket at the end of my road, at the end of Morley Road. So again, the majority of it was done by the Foulkes family, and some very fine facades to those shops as well. I think at the time, impressive row of shops.
Okay, well, look, Jonathan, I want to thank you very much for an informative, interesting talk. It's clear that we're all going to have to buy your book to find a lot more. You can't possibly in 20 minutes do a complete justice to the whole area, but it has brought the area, you know, we walk around these streets every day, and it's helped to bring the whole area alive. And I especially like the way you brought out the individuals and the people, and finding the photographs and stuff is really, really good. So I hope that everyone will want to go and buy your book. I certainly will, because the Charles Harry Pharmacy, what could be easier? For those in the audience, we will have a go at trying to answer some of the questions that we haven't covered at the end there, or encourage you to look at the Friends of Marble Hill website in due course. We will try and cover off some of the issues that have been raised separately. For now, I hope that we have introduced ourselves to you, the Friends of Marble Hill have been introduced to you, that you'll be inspired to perhaps support the Friends by going to our website, friendsofmarblehill.org, and signing up to our newsletter. And you'll also there get information about our future talks programme. And Jonathan's already mentioned Minna Anderson's talk on the 25th of March. And with that, I want to thank Jonathan again on your behalf, and thank all of you, almost 120 of you, for coming along to our first talk. And I hope we see you again very soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much.